Yeah, so I was in Capital One from 2018 to 2020, and the large scale data breach happened in 2019. And in case anybody's not familiar with it, there was a former AWS employee who had a really robust knowledge of how to use AWS in order to steal data. And so, what this insider was able to do, who was no longer employed at AWS at that point in time, was to figure out, hey, I could do server-side request forgery attacks and steal session keys from EC2 metadata service. And so we at Capital One had used a firewall from ModSec WAF. So a free open source firewall for many years. And even before I had gotten there, we had basically replaced most of it with a Barracuda, which was a newer web application firewall. What we actually had missed was not everything was truly ported over. And so if you have things that are lying around in this massive shift, that's something always, pay attention to. The second thing that I would say is when you use a web application firewall or a proxy firewall, there's kind of two ways you can set it. You can set it for a forward proxy configuration or a reverse proxy configuration. And it's really important to know which one you're doing, because if you do it the wrong way, you create something called a server-side request forgery attack. And that is exactly what happened in the case of Capital One, which is we had a WAF that was misconfigured, and it enabled a server-side request forgery attack, which allowed that individual to get access to the EC2 metadata service to then be able to steal anything that an EC2 would have access to, like data stored on an S3 bucket. So this is just kind of the quick little overview before I kind of dig into some of the more details. But is it making sense so far?
Yeah. No, that's a great intro. And yeah, before we get dive into the details, maybe can you share why did this incident become such a case study for cloud security?
Yeah, so I think the first thing about it was in 2019, and yes, there had been a lot of AWS attacks, but most of them are what I would call dumb attacks. People left exposed data in public S3 buckets that should have never been public. Well, that's an easy misconfiguration that people make, and it's not really too tricky.
New images coming in tonight, a major FBI raid after that massive data breach involving Capital One Bank, affecting more than 100 million people. Your bank account information, your social security numbers. And here's ABC's chief business correspondent, Rebecca Jarvis, tonight.
But here we're talking about a former AWS employee who basically had insider knowledge of how EC2 metadata service worked. And I don't think a lot of people actually had that understanding before this attack. Like, nobody really knew you could use things like this. And what also happened was there's a couple other things that are interesting at this space. So at this point in time, in 2019, Capital One was really big on AWS. We were using AWS for so many things in cybersecurity, including things like Guard Duty, which is a data loss prevention tool. Now, what this insider was able to really understand is when AWS builds out a brand new region, let's call this the Bahrain region, they don't actually put every AWS service out there on day one. They only have a small set of core services, and then eventually they add more and more services till it looks like a normal region. So this individual was very astute, and what they were able to do is essentially wait till a new region opened, and then they, perform this attack to steal data out of our company and other companies. And because it came out of the Bahrain region, things like all these data loss prevention tools just didn't exist, which meant they could pull data and we wouldn't have the ability to monitor that data exfil because that capability wasn't in region. So that was a first big aha moment of, oh my goodness, people don't understand that, let's call it AWS security services, may not actually be applicable in every region that you think they are. And that was another, big aha moment for us. But a second thing that I would actually maybe kind of call out is at this point in time, the EC2 metadata service was not very secure. And that's why directly after the attack, AWS actually released the version 2 of the EC2 metadata service, where you have to provide additional information like tokens and keys in order to get access through it. And so, this is something where you can actually say, AWS wasn't offering secure things. We clearly had a misconfigured proxy server, which tools wouldn't really detect because both a forward proxy and reverse proxy are valid configs depending on what you're trying to do. So there wasn't an easy way for us to know that this had been misconfigured by developers. And at the same time, now we're losing data in a way that is not, really acceptable from any large scale bank.
So I guess, so that's a very specific situation that happened in that particular case. But if we kind of zoom out a little bit, if a CISO heard, WAF misconfiguration, SSRF, permission, assumptions and thought, hey, we fixed this years ago? Like, how would you challenge that kind of assumption or statement?
I think the first thing that I would say is every organization goes through modernization processes in their organization. There's some tool you're going to replace. Maybe you hated Splunk and their Splunk fees went up too high and you're like, we're going on a new tool, or it's an EDR or a firewall or any of these things. What we find is historically organizations will track something till it gets to 98, 90% compliant, and they never actually do that last 1%. It goes on a risk register. People don't actually, follow it up because they just want to move forward with the next initiative. And those little gaps are what's called the chinks in the armor. If people are able to use AI tools to do attack surface discovery, sometimes they can find these things that should have just been configured properly, but we just never got around to doing it. So I think that's the first thing to really look at and say, hey, how do we get to 100%? How do we know these things don't happen? You can just think of like SolarWinds, right? SolarWinds had another, major supply chain attack, and maybe you used SolarWinds 2-3 years before the attack happened, but then you got off SolarWinds. Is there SolarWinds still laying around in your landscape that may actually cause you damage? Things like this are really important for organizations to understand, because a lot of times we just move on quickly instead of really getting to 100% compliance.
And could you maybe take us back to what were the first indications of a problem? Like, so how did this get discovered and what were the first kind of steps taken?
Yeah. So I'm not going to reveal that because I still think that's a little bit sensitive of how Capital One first determined that piece of what it happened. But let's just say once a indicator that this bad actor is abusing your AWS environment is happening, then it's how do you quickly build an evidence package and be able to submit that to law enforcement? So then afterwards, you can essentially go and do a takedown or, some type of interdiction against this individual. And the thing that really happened here is Capital One had a great team who had, previously worked with law enforcement, came from intelligence agencies. You can just think of, hey, we're in DC. There's a lot of former FBI, former CIA, former kind of intel folks working at Capital One that were able to quickly turn this around in less than a day and then essentially do the takedown and stop operation in less than a week. So that type of speed and scale, I think, is where Capital One really shone. I think the problem that we had was how did we actually detect this? Because it clearly wasn't through Capital One's internal means, because tools like the DLP had been turned off because it wasn't in region. So just knowing where those gaps are for your company, I think, is the big takeaway here.
Yeah, the attacker seems to, pick the bad, like one of the worst targets there with the history of the people working there. That's pretty interesting. Did the attacker only target Capital One, or were there other targets at the same time? Because it seems like a kind of broad AWS issue, not one that's specific to Capital One either.
Yeah, it was my understanding that this individual was scanning numerous companies to find these server-side request forgery attacks to do the EC2 metadata. So you can imagine they're using tools like Shodan to kind of figure out where this exists. It's a very niche case of, getting to EC2 metadata service. But, once you're there, you can get access to all these S3 buckets that are there. And, some of the things that ultimately were, revealed was Capital One had thought we had actually encrypted all of our data in our S3 buckets. But lo and behold, to us, it wasn't truly that way in implementation. And so we had a number of North American and Canadian, let's say, credit card information that was compromised that then, of course, we had to do, disclosures to attorney general offices and things like that in order to do the cleanup process.
If this kind of stuff happens today to any kind of CISO or company, like what evidence would you recommend that you'd want to like collect and have as a CISO for a similar kind of exploitable event here in your environment? Like what would be the recommendation there?
I think the first thing to say is when anybody connects into our environment, do we absolutely know the source IP and have we proven multi-factor authentication, right? And so that is the key, because if you really know who they are and where they came from, that's a really, really good thing of what you can give to law enforcement to try to do a takedown operation. Now, obviously, people can masquerade their IPs, but you at least have one place of where it's originally entering your organization from. I think that's the real key. And then the other thing that I would say is how do you actually, tie things back to user accounts? So much of things on the internet they can be static S3 pages where nobody can actually harm those sites. But in order to get to anything that really requires user input, how do you actually put that behind a single sign-on tool for customers where now we know here's the username, here's the account, here's the information about that account that then is going to then, let's say, try to harm our website when they start, fuzzing with malicious inputs on forms and fields and URLs.
I guess after this particular event, what did this experience teach you about security teams and where they waste their time? Which I'm sure there's some lessons for your book that came out of that.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing here for me was what are the things we think that are secure that just really aren't. And I'll just give you some examples here. I already mentioned that there's security initiatives you think that are completed, but maybe only got 99% complete. I think that's the first aha moment. The second thing that I would say is what are the protections that you're deploying today that actually aren't protecting you? And I'll just give you an example. Imagine you have a web application and you put a firewall like a WAF in front of that web application. And your developers complain and say, it's actually, not working well with our site and causing some functionality issues. So what do most teams do? They go and they neuter the WAF and they turn off some of the rules. And so what happens is that CISO may not know that level of detail because that's, between an engineer on the WAF team and a developer in, some part of the organization. And so they think their, WAF is actually stopping all the OWASP top 10 attacks on all their sites. But lo and behold, we've actually made it a Swiss cheese firewall where there's holes and things we've turned off. And I think that happens more than you absolutely know at the CISO level. And so a lot of times we're thinking, oh, here's Log4j or some other things. And we're like, well, we have a WAF. It just stops those things. Well, only if the WAF is actually implemented correctly, right? And so are you actually able to go in and document everything like this on the risk register and know that? Or is that just like hidden only in firewall rules where only the dev team from 3 years ago who doesn't exist anymore because they've all changed jobs actually knows that insider knowledge, right? Those are the things I think that are really important to kind of, think about what percent of my tools are actually 100% deployed and what percent of my tools are 100% configured correctly. Those would be, I think, key nuggets there on that root cause analysis.